Welcome everyone, today is Sunday and in a move which shocked the world, I am actually bothered enough to turn on my camera. What do we owe the pleasure of this camera being on? Well, today we have an update. We have our weekly Mythic Plus review that we have been actually postponing for a little bit because the last time we looked at this was 11 days ago. So it's time to go back and check how things have been going in Mythic Plus, especially given the few changes happening, in particular to one of the specs you might have noticed already, starting to make way in Mythic Plus groups. So let's start to take a look at how things have been progressing by using once again our three different segments of the situation. One was at the start of all of these balance changes, buffs and nerfs of a bit over a month ago. The next one was from basically the last time we checked this, a bit over a week ago. And then we have the situation right now for tanks. This is for keys at level 20 and above. The difference is, of course, the noticeable growth, once again, as we mentioned last week as well, the noticeable growth of Protection Paladin. Protection Warrior has been losing quite a bit. Blood Death Knight has remained more or less as the second most represented tank, and then the other three have been more or less underplayed throughout this entire patch. Vengeance, Guardian Druid and Brewmaster Monk. The situation gets a little bit more spicy once we get into the 25 level keys, because in the 25 level keys we see the significant growth of Protection Paladin. That is gonna be the outstanding change for this week. The amount of notice that this spec is receiving recently, it is now being made part of many of the top groups in Mythic Plus are currently running with a Protection Paladin. Now, the interesting part is that this Protection Paladin sudden resurgence isn't really due to some huge, massive buffs or maybe nerfs to Protection Warrior. This was the last nerf that Protection Warrior received, and this one was from a month ago. This one was the last buff which Protection Paladin received, and this one was from 2 weeks ago. The damage buff given to Protection Paladin. And this damage buff was definitely not enough to make them suddenly do some top damage. Protection Paladin is still doing less damage than Protection Warrior, even after this buff. And also, it is still doing less damage, much less damage, than Brewmaster Monk. So, it's definitely not this buff which made them start to become relevant, and it's definitely not the Protection Warrior nerf that made Protection Paladin start to become more relevant. The answer is simply one of the very rare answers, which is players just forgot about them. Protection Warrior was meta as a raid tank, so if you wanted to raid, you were playing Protection Warrior. Protection Warrior was also strong in Mythic Plus. Just hit 2 birds with 1 stone and play Protection Warrior. Protection Warrior was already strong since the start. Many players already planned to play Protection Warrior anyways, so Protection Paladin was left on a shelf, despite the fact that, as we see right now, is definitely strong. Then you have the other part as to why Protection Paladin is growing so much, because there is a 10.0.7 rework happening to Paladin. It is happening, of course, the big part of the rework is going to Retribution Paladin, but there are some also significant differences going around the tree of Protection Paladin and also of the general tree of Paladin, which is overall buffing the Paladin class significantly. So Protection Paladin will also benefit from this rework in 10.0.7. So you also have more tanks getting interested, becoming more interested in the state of Protection Paladin and being more willing to play the spec. So that is perhaps the reason why we have started to see much more of a growth to Protection Paladin already, even though they haven't technically been buffed by that much, at the very least, yet. Now, besides the tanks, not much is happening for the healers in terms of movements in the 20 plus range. You still have the very, very clear divide between the top 2 healers and all of the rest. The more noticeable change is happening in the 25 range, because even after 11 days. As we mentioned, we have an even closer, an even smaller gap between Preservation Evoker and Restoration Druid. The difference between the two specs is much narrower now at the very high keys. There isn't really that much of a growth on the other healing specs, however, despite, always worth mentioning, despite how much they have been buffed recently. Restoration Shaman, Mystery Monk, Discipline Priest has received many buffs over time. So far, at the very least, it has not amounted to too much in Mythic Plus. Next in line is the melee DPS. As we check all the way back to almost a month ago, we can still see the growth of Arms Warrior, which is getting closer and closer to Fury Warrior. We can also see the almost overtaking of Subtlety Rogue, which is now getting much closer to Outlaw Rogue compared to, well, over a month ago, and still grew compared to last week. Besides that, the only other slightly thing worth mentioning is the slight growth of Retribution Paladin. I'm saying slight, but they go from 3% to 6% of all the melee population, so they literally doubled in representation. But of course, once you look at the big picture, they are still quite low compared to all of the other specs. Once again, as we mentioned for Prot Paladin, this might be due to the more interest going the way of Red Paladin because of their impending rework happening in patch 10.0.7. So you might have some of the players already prepping their Red Paladin in anticipation for the patch, which seems like they will make them obscenely OP if things keep going this way. So perhaps that's the reason why we are getting more Red Paladin players in the melee camp. The situation, however, goes back to a little bit more of a 3-horse race. Once we go to the 25+ range of keys also, we have an overtaking here actually, because Subtlety becomes the most popular of the rogue specs over Outlaw, and then the other option is Havoc Demon Hunter. The very popular warriors basically disappear in 25+ keys compared to their popularity in 20+ keys. The only other couple of specs which can keep up with Rogue or Demon Hunter are Enhancement and Windwalker. What is worth mentioning is that Enhancement continues to grow at a very high key level. We will see in a bit as we look at the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus, but Enhancement does continue to become more popular at that high level of keys. The last camp we are currently looking at is the Ranged DPS. So in almost a month and a half from the first time we started getting balance tuning to last week to today, the major changes are that Beast Mastery continues to grow and gets to the near even level of Marksmanship Hunter. We have also checked yesterday the Hunter fixes that will go the way of Hunters, which will be more beneficial overall to Beast Mastery. So maybe we will continue to have even more presence of Beast Mastery Hunters in Mythic Plus. We also have a continued growth of Shadow Priest, given how more popular they are becoming in Mythic Plus. There's been continued growth of Frost Mage compared to the other two mage specs in Mythic Plus, and also, finally, the overtaking of Destruction Warlock, which overtook Demonology. If we go all the way back to early January, 21% of all ranged DPS were Demo. Now it's Destruction, the top dog in the Warlock class. Not too much else happening at this level of key for the ranged DPS. No real growth of specs like Devastation, even though Devastation was buffed by quite a bit. No real growth of Balanced Druid either, which is interesting. And of course, why would we be expecting any growth for Elemental Shaman, since they are not really receiving any attention from Blizzard. As we checked last week, the highest level of keys for the ranged DPS had this very interesting split between Balanced Druid and Shadow Priest. This is going to continue this week, except now it's Shadow Priest, which gains even more population, and at the moment it has now crowned itself as the most popular ranged DPS at high keys. No real significant change besides them compared to 10 days or so ago when we checked this the last time. What we can, however, look at are, of course, the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus to give you an idea of the meta, to give you an idea of what players go for when assembling their group. So the first time we looked at this, before any balance tuning came along, after New Year's, it was of course a wall of brown for tanks. It was also a quite more popular setting for restoration druids, and as far as the DPS were concerned, it was a lot of marksmanship hunters, quite a lot of rogues, Havoc Demon Hunters, and the rest was being kept for warlocks and Windwalker monks. After about a month and quite a few rounds of tuning, we still saw a wall of brown with just a tiny little hole right at the bottom of Protection Paladin. We also saw the new entries of quite a few other specs. We saw the new entries of Shadow Priest, we saw the new entries of Balance Druids, we saw the new entries of Enhancement Shamans, and Warlocks were starting to leave, Marksmanship Hunters were starting to leave, Windwalker Monks were actually leaving altogether the top 12 most popular groups in Mythic Plus. Now, 11 days later, the wall of brown for tanks has more or less been broken completely, because now, out of 12 groups, there are going to be 7 of them with Protection Paladins. So actually, for the first time since we started looking at this, since the start of the season, we have more group compositions making up a Protection Paladin over a Protection Warrior. We continue to have also a pretty even split nowadays between Preservation Evoker and Restoration Druid. As for the DPS, we have even more Shadow Priests compared to last time. We also have even more Enhancement Shamans compared to the last time. What has happened is that we have lost all of the Warlocks. We have also lost all of the Hunters. And we continue to lose all of the Windwalker Monks as well. So now the top groups are made up by Havoc, Enhancement and Rogues for the melee, and then Balance Druid and Shadow Priest for the range camp, with just one combo breaker at the bottom being Frost Mage. So what this tells us, if anything, is that we have gotten quite a bit of a variety, quite a bit of a change in what you see in Mythic Plus. Compare this to Season 3, the last seasons of Shadowlands, where your group was made up of one Survival Hunter, one Destruction Warlock, and then one random pick at the end, usually a Windwalker Monk, maybe a rogue. Now it has gotten much more varied, you can say this, right? We have gotten much less of a dominance of a single tank now. Before you were seeing Protection Warriors, but once in a while you were seeing Death Knights as well. Now, on top of these two, you're also adding Protection Paladin. Before, you might have seen a lot of Havoc Demon Hunters, Marksmanship Hunters, Demonology Warlocks. Then you started seeing more Outlaw Rogues, which then turned into Subtlety Rogues, and then you started seeing more Enhancement Shamans, Shadow Priests, Balance Druids. So we are getting, it seems like we are getting more variety, more change in what you see in your keys in Mythic Plus. Once you start, of course, once you start getting at a high enough level where you start looking at how to make up your group. Of course, don't try to look for proper top-tier compositions if you're trying to do a plus 17. You don't need an S-tier meta group to clear a plus 17. I'm talking about the more challenging key levels. We are seeing more difference, more change compared to the more staleness of previous seasons, at the very least for now. So, with this being said, we are done with our weekly review, our update of the situation in Mythic Plus. We are seeing some changes when it comes to the DPS, way more growth for specs like Shadow Priests, for specs like Balance Druid, and for specs like Enhancement Shaman, and less of a presence for specs like Windwalker, Demolocks, and Marksmanship Hunters. And then the main point, the main course of the day is the growth of Protection Paladin, for which I'm only assuming will become even bigger once 10.0.7 hits. For today, this is all we have to talk about when it comes to Mythic Plus. We are going to leave each other, and as usual, I'm starting the leaving each other segment by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of this channel. You can still, however, do this completely for free, like liking and commenting down below or subscribing to the channel itself. Also, other free ways to support would be to follow me on Twitter right over at this link, or also to follow me over on my stream at Twitch. That will be also a good way to support. And with this out of the way, we can now leave each other, and we can also now shut this light off because we don't need the camera anymore. Nice. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, something must be done about this light. My poor delicate eyes.